Hi, today I want to explain to you the stuff that I have written on the board. And what this is going to tell you is how the federal government does not have authority over people. So you and I, they don't have authority over, they don't have authority over our land. We don't come under their exclusive legislative jurisdiction or any of their other jurisdictions. So this board might look a little bit complicated, but it's really not. And once you understand it, you'll understand why you are already, in fact, free, sovereign, and independent. So you had people, and it requires a population in order to create a state. So people create states, but people create independent states. They don't create a dependent state. They create independent states. And in the Articles of Confederation, the independent states are free, sovereign, and independent. And these independent states includes the people, the free people, you and I. So we have an independent state here, according to the Articles of Confederation, free, sovereign, and independent. And you have to have an independent state to create a system of defense so that all the states can be equally defended. All the independent states can be equally defended against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So the independent states that were existing at the time of about 1789 or so sent delegates to create a federal government, and this federal government would create dependent states within the independent states. Now these dependent states are federal lands. These federal lands were purchased by the federal government from the independent state. They were purchased in accordance to the contract called the Constitution for defense purposes. I want to show you defense in the Constitution is written with a C, not an S, the way they write it now. Why was it written with a C? What they tell you when they're lying to you is that they misspelled it in the Constitution, as if we would believe that the writers, smart enough to know foreign languages, world history, and smart enough to write a constitution, would misspell a simple word with so much meaning. So defense with a C comes from Old French and means fortification. And if you look to the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, fortification, the types of fortification are listed there. They obviously meant defense with a C, because defense with an S is Latin. It comes from Latin and it means vengeance. Nothing in the Constitution shows that our federal government was in any way, shape, or form seeking vengeance. But when the government changed the spelling of the word, it made me think they were seeking vengeance against the people of the independent states because they wanted to take them over. And if you don't believe me, just look to what they've done. Now they're telling everyone we have to get a vaccine. So the independent states created the federal government, and the federal government created dependent states within the independent states by purchasing lands for defense. The lands were going to be exclusively legislated by the federal government, which means the independent states had no say-so in what happened on the federal lands. This is just an example. This is an independent state. This is an independent state, independent state, independent state. The black dots are the dependent states within the independent states. These are also called areas, enclaves, islands, federal lands, military reservations, posts, forts, arsenals, and if you're by the water, we can say that this was water here, ports. Exclusive legislative jurisdiction was not arbitrary, however. There's a list in Article 1, Section 8 of all the things that the federal government could do on these dependent lands. The list is well defined. The list includes taxes. So when you're paying a tax to the federal government, you're telling the federal government that you're on dependent lands for defense purposes and under the exclusive legislative jurisdiction of the Congress, of the federal Congress. It so happens that Title 26 is not actually a law. It can't be a law. It can't be a law because they use it outside of the independent state. I'll get more on that on another video, which is called Positive Law and Positive Law Citations. Now, when a lot of people don't understand secession, and we're confused. We're confused about, can the independent state secede from the Union? Can the dependent state secede from the Union? Since both of these are called states, it's confusing as to what the federal government is talking about in laws and case laws. Are they talking about the independent state not being able to secede from the Union? Or are they talking about the dependent states not being able to secede from the Union? The federal government only has jurisdiction over the dependent states. So when it writes laws or adjudicates the law, it can only be talking about the independent states because it never had any kind of jurisdiction over the dependent state or the people of the dependent state. So the dependent state cannot become an independent state without violence. And this is shown in Texas v. White. When I read this case law, I was at first confused. Why would the federal government tell an independent state that it cannot leave the Union, all the while saying that the people were in charge and the people could change the form of government anytime they chose? This is why. Because the federal government has control of the dependent state, and the dependent state cannot secede from the Union because the federal government doesn't actually own it. The independent state does. These are the lands that were originally annexed to the federal government for defense purposes. The independent state can take back its lands from the federal government, and that is the secession by the independent state. The dependent state, created by the federal government with the permission of the dependent state, cannot become an independent state without violence. That would be like a military post deciding it was either going to, alone or with other posts, become an independent state. These areas, military areas, since they are dependent, would not be able to become independent through secession without violence. That would be the military waging war on itself or its government or the independent state. Most people believe that when the Constitution talks about the states, it's talking about these states: Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Washington, Oregon, Tennessee, Mississippi, etc. So these independent states can secede from the federal government without violence. But before it does so, you have to understand that when you leave the Union, you take these areas with you because they were always yours. Now I have some dots here, some dashes in between all these areas, and they go from military post to military post, and they go from state to state. I should say independent state to independent state. These areas are the roads that the independent state allowed the federal government to also make laws for. That does not mean the federal government gets to regulate the free, sovereign, and independent people of the independent state. No. That's not what that means. That means in coordination with their states and the independent state, it can make rules and regulations for the military people to follow when traveling on our roads from post to post or state to state, and that the independent state would not interfere. This is important in times of war, because in war times you might have a state decide it's left the Union, or it doesn't want to participate in a war, and it blocks the passage of the people of the federal government from going from one independent state to another independent state, from one dependent state in an independent state to another military post in an independent state. So that's why it had to have either concurrent or partial legislative jurisdiction over the roads. If you look to the law enforcement title in the federal codes, it does not have a positive law, just like Title 26 for taxes does not have a positive law citation in it, meaning it does not comply with the Constitution. It's not constitutional and it's not federalistic. It doesn't comply with the ideas of federalism that the founders intended when they wrote the Constitution. The police in the independent state or the dependent state we have to establish who these police work for before we can decide whether or not we're going to let them stop us on the roads and ticket us. So here you now understand why you're already free, because you're in the independent state. You are free, sovereign, and independent. You have nothing to do with the dependent state unless you're an officer or employee of the federal government, meaning you're either in the military or you work for the military. Here's a few more thoughts that I have. The Congress, according to the Constitution, was only required to meet once a year. I think that's because the founders who wrote the Constitution didn't intend to be in a constant state of war, where the Congress had to meet in Washington every day or 5 days a week. They would only meet once a year, maybe to get to know each other and hear the State of the Union and talk about what's going on, or to, for whatever purposes they might want to meet for. But other than that, they would only meet during wartime, and they would be sent from the states on the roads with concurrent jurisdiction all the way to Washington to meet at the Capitol to organize war efforts. And this seems to me to be the proper way of interpreting the Constitution. I also have a map, and it's going to be hard to see, but it's from nationalatlas.gov. I got this from a federal government office, and it tells you here where, here's the key, where the federal lands are in the state. And you can get these for your state just by contacting nationalatlas.gov or just going on their website and downloading a map. So it has Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Defense, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and National Park Services. These are other places that the federal government have acquired in the independent states for various purposes, where they might have proprietorial interest, they might have concurrent legislative jurisdiction, etc. But it doesn't matter what they have acquired. They can acquire all the lands they want, but they can always be kicked out. The independent state has to do it though. The dependent state cannot kick them out. So in my next video, I'm going to talk about positive law and how if a title does not have a positive law citation, it's not a law, it's a business contract. And I'll talk about the legal state next.